Languedoc, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this CASI Web Talks presentation. Our featured speaker today is Glenn Priestley, Executive Director of the Northern Air Transport Association. On my left, your right. If you attended our Aero 2017 conference last month in Toronto, you had the opportunity to hear Glenn and perhaps to meet him as one of the participants in the opening plenary panel of the conference. Glenn has spent all of his working life involved with aviation. He learned to fly in Welland, Ontario, and by the mid-1980s, he was maintaining flying currency on a wide variety of multi-engine, reciprocating, and turbine aircraft while specializing in Medevac missions and remote operations. He has fulfilled a wide variety of responsibilities with major Canadian aviation organizations such as Transport Canada, the Canadian Owners and Pilots Association, the Air Transport Association of Canada, and the Canadian Business Aviation Association. Prior to joining NATA, he held a senior management position with the Canadian Council for Aviation and Aerospace. Glenn's topic today is Northern Canada's aviation infrastructure, research and development opportunities. For so many reasons, Canada's northern regions are making headlines every day, and the infrastructure required to support air operations is of ever-increasing importance. We'll pass along your questions to Glenn once he has finished his presentation. Glenn, let's not keep our audience waiting any longer. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. Pleasure to be here today. In the next 10 to 12, 13 minutes or so, what I'm hoping to do is to provide you with some oversight, some ideas in some of the areas that could be some research and development opportunities. First of all, I always like to just situate ourselves, what we're talking about the north. It's the area of Canada, almost half the size of Canada, 40% the size of Western Europe. I'd like to show the route structures of our of the various airlines up in the north. And I'm going to be referencing the Office of the Auditor General's report that was released on May 17th of this year. The Auditor General did an audit of Transport Canada's support of the North in aviation infrastructure, and they looked at 117 airports. This picture here represents these airports. Of those airports, only 10 of them are paved. The rest are gravel. Many of them are in need of help, as you're going to see. Now, carrying on, there was two recommendations from the Auditor General's report. One was that Transport Canada should work with stakeholders to determine what sources of funding are needed, and then we need to know what should the funding be used for. A little bit of history here. In 1995, the Canadian Airport Act devolved the Canadian airport system to private ownerships, or in the case of the capital airports, into leased arrangements. As we progressed over the years, various other agencies and territories and provinces got involved in running airport infrastructure, and removing this authority away from the federal government. Again, this whole presentation will be available to anybody on request, and it'll be on the website. But you can easily see that the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and now the new territory of Nunavut have well over $1 billion requirement in airport infrastructure. It's quite a challenge. As we move along, the next slide here talks about the Airport Capital Assistance Program, is known as ACAP. This was set up to provide funding to airports now that have been certified by Transport Canada, but are now no longer owned or operated by the federal government. And they have to offer year-round regular scheduled passenger service of at least 1,000 passengers a year for 3 consecutive years. It's about 200 airports that apply for this, but what you'll find as we go through this presentation, the ACAP is failing in providing the funding for the amount of revenue that is brought in. ACAP funding primarily is from government general revenues, but airport rent brings in approximately $300 to $350 million per year, of which under the ACAP program, approximately $35 million is reinvested into the Canadian airport infrastructure. We think there's lots of opportunity there to spend that money better and more. Here's some of the recommendations, folks, from the Auditor General's report of May 17th. This was also supported by last year's report by Mr. Emerson, who did the Canadian Transportation Act review. And the findings were very similar. They found that the northern airports received some funding, approximately, as I said, 38 million. However, there's a lot more needed. In 616, they now that they were going to address the transportation infrastructure in the north. However, there's been nothing done. So again, the pressure's on Transport Canada to come up with a program of sustainable investment. So what are the infrastructure technological challenges and opportunities, and where is the funding support? What we found in the north, of course, is that flying in the north or flying in the south, excuse me, is exactly the same. The aircraft they used are the same now. It isn't what you may see on TV. We're making great strides with our technology and the passenger experience. Where we're indicating problems is with the infrastructure shortfalls. 45% of the airports recognized out of the 117 in the Auditor General's report have insufficient navigational approach aids to help the airplane land. Over 35% of them have inadequate approach lighting to help the aircraft find the airport and land. We also have the problem in that the aircraft that can land on gravel runways are now 40 years old. That's the picture there of the 737-200. We just do not have the aircraft that can land on the gravel, which is reducing the traveler's experience and service to many of the communities in the north. Here's a good picture here on this next slide of a Grease Ford airstrip, and clearly marked in this case that is for Twin Otters only. Again, Twin Otter, 40-year-old airplane, great aircraft, but here's an airport that needs an awful lot of investment to bring it up to the level in which we can start bringing in the ATRs and the Dash 8s turboprop aircraft. The comments noticed there by Captain Black of First Air, who was brought in on the Auditor General's report. The modern airplane probably burns less than half the fuel, carries more weight, and it does it at far less cost per trip. These are all very strong environmental impact statements, why we need to invest in the infrastructure so that we can support ways to improve the coming climate change. And this slide really points out the issues of climate change. We speak about it every day in southern Canada. I'm not sure if we recognize it as readily as we do in the north. In the north, it is very, very apparent as the permafrost is melting. And melted permafrost, once it melts, when it refreezes, it's about 10 to 15% of its size. So here's a good picture of a road that is going through a massive amount of permafrost allocation movement, and a study's underway to see how we can somehow stop this. Here's one of the ways we're looking at. Again, as we mentioned, the challenge is to find a better way, better surface covering than gravel. Asphalt is problematic. It takes 3 years to build a runway in the north. It takes a year to do the layout, a year to get the material delivered in place, then a year to build it. And then within 10 years, you have to do it again. That's about the life expectancy of asphalt. The other problem with asphalt, of course, is black. Black attracts light. That's not going to help with the permafrost, so it's an added problem. In the pictures we're showing here, top right-hand corner, and the dust that you're seeing there, that's a 737 landing of Air North, landing at Cambridge Bay. As you can see, there's quite a dust storm coming up behind it. It could be Dawson, actually, now that I think about it. We have formed as NATA and has a resolution that we want to get a test project going. We met and on April 26th in Yellowknife at our meeting, and we have now formed a consortium of people, and we're now looking at how to test different runway surface, such as in that middle picture there, aluminum. We now have a test center in Cambridge Bay opening up, in which we're seeing in which we can reduce the damage caused by airplanes, which is approximately $100 million a year across North America. And in the north, easily 10% of that $10 million on an annual basis, and fixing the runways from short damage and keeping them from causing damage to aircraft, which happens on virtually every takeoff. It just has to. It's a problem. The other type of stuff that's going on, folks, so again, on that slide there, we're working with various organizations to do the research and development, and again, opportunity there for people to of that engineering background. How can we do things better? In this next slide, for instance, in the lower left-hand corner, that's an airport known as Pangnirtung. That airport meets no government standards. As you can see, it begins and ends. At one ending, it ends on the water, and the other end, it ends in the middle of town. That is not the way a runway should end. It's a high risk. That whole airport needs to move, and that's the only solution for that airport. Again, not easy solutions, but again, I point out on this other slide the work that's going on. This is a research and development opportunities presentation. The Dew Line remediation project underway is a huge success story for Canada. The lower right-hand picture is a picture of the remnants of what was left over when they built the initial distance early warning line. Lots of work involved on how to recapture and recycle all these oil drums. I swear I don't think an oil drum was ever taken out of the north. It was just, they were all brought in. So lots of work to be done from that perspective. Many of the airports need to have environmental cleanups done before we can do what we want to do, for instance, with Pangnirtung, which is located on Baffinland. Here's another area at which we're making great strides, and this is in which we can find ways to get better weather observation and forecasting. A lot more work to be done here, but we're very pleased with NAV Canada and the work that they're doing. On the left, you can see we've got runway cameras installed at the beginning and end of most of the northern airports now. That's been a very good project, but again, more line of sight is required. And there's more work to be done to move to the next grade of the cameras. There's some talk is can we make the camera infrared, for instance. On the right-hand side is AWOS, and that's the automatic weather observation system. And again, we have a problem of manpower in the north, people power in the north, and can we get a commensurate level of service with a AWOS automatic reporting system, since we can't get people located in all the airports that we have to fly to. Again, it's a huge service and delivery problem when we cannot get adequate and timely weather information. Quite often, we're well advanced into the flight before we find out that our destination is not able to accept aircraft. Along with that, as we know from Aero 17, the CASI show last month in Toronto, airships are coming along, and it was just yesterday in Transport Canada. I had a meeting with the Director General in which McDonald had just been in giving a presentation on Lockheed Martin, I should say, I'm sorry, on their airship. They figure it's going to be ready within a year. Getting the asset airborne and moving is one thing. Having it to be able to be received at the other end is also part of the infrastructure development of new technology. Again, there is opportunity, and this is exciting technology that's being brought out. It's not to replace the cargo airplanes right off the bat, but it certainly is going to bring another dimension to the resupply of northern settlements and of course, the development of mining opportunities. The other one that's coming along, and huge opportunity, as a matter of fact, it's tomorrow, I believe. NAV Canada is launching the next constellation of 10 satellites as part of their Ariane system, which is going to move any form of ground-based technology into a satellite-based system. And what does ADS-B stand for? Well, it's the Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast Out. Once this system comes online in the United States of America, all overflight requires it by 2020. We are way behind in getting our aircraft service for this. Huge opportunity for avionics engineers and avionics maintenance, repair, and overhaul locations to get the Canadian fleet equipped with the ADS-B by 2020. This technology, in a nutshell, will mean we'll never, ever lose an aircraft again, is the hope. How does it work? As I said, it's a constellation of satellites. that basically interrogate the aircraft. I believe it's like every 20 seconds, so that they can follow the aircraft where it is. It gives out its position to the satellites that set at the ground bases. Fascinating where this is going to go, and it ties into the instrument approaches as well. Canada is an industry leader when it comes to medevac. We have long, lonely routes. We have a lot of settlements, and quite often we speak of northern Canada, we just think of the high north. There's actually 4 different norths, and there's 4 different ways of doing business in the north as far as medevac services and the way we move. And then we also have our coastal areas as well. Newfoundland has a very robust medevac system, and it's come a long way. We move thousands of patients per year, whether it's patient repatriation, schedule appointments into larger settlements, or emergency flights. Again, the technology with web-based technology, rather than bring the patient out of the community, can we deliver better services in the community? Can we have a remote doctor, in other words? How can we better work our system to better serve our Canadians? It's a huge challenge, and it's a huge cost. The technology increases have been huge, but now can we do something better in community is one of the challenges. One of the big challenges for the North is accommodation, and the NATA membership has invested hugely in location apartments in the Iqaluit, Rankin Inlet, Cambridge Bay, Yellowknife, because most people who are flying in the North come in on 2 to 4 week rotation and then stay for 2 to 4 weeks depending on the mission. Again, the challenge of affordable accommodation in the North is profound. The opportunity for research and development into new materials, the use of recycled materials in support of community development and investment is huge. Because one of the things that's important is to build up the community and therefore territorial resilience, so that there's enough people to be able to do the job, to live the life, to provide the same level of expectations from life as all Canadians should get. This here is a summary of the future of transportation in Canada. This was the speech that the minister gave on April 27th. Well, he gave this speech in late 2016 on, I think it was November 5th, but he announced that he began consulting on 5 areas, and this is the safer transportation. How can we keep travelers and communities safe? Trade corridors to global markets, green and innovative transportation, and the traveler, waterways, coasts, and the North is where the minister is putting his priorities. And there's the speech on November 3rd where he pointed out that must make investments in the North because in many cases what they found is antiquated. Just this week I was in a meeting with the Canadian Transportation Agency on accessibility for all Canadians, regardless of whatever challenges or disabilities they may have. All should have opportunity to have access to aviation. We can get the modern aircraft of today can carry just about any form of disabled person. Our issue is when we get to airports in the North, quite often we don't have that linkage with the infrastructure that you might, those who are listening can think about when you're at Toronto Pearson or Ottawa with bridges and gates and that kind of investment. So again, how can we make sure that we're providing the traveler with a dignified traveling experience is always one of the goals that we're trying to do. The Northern Air Transport Association believes that northern aviation transportation infrastructure is a federal responsibility. We believe that a percentage of the national AIF, that's the Airport Improvement Fee, collectively should be used to fund northern and remote airports. Every airport since 1997 and the development of the National Airport Program now has some form of a tax that all travelers pay for infrastructure and capital development. We believe that a portion of that from the larger airports, Montreal, Toronto, etc., could be used, particularly in the airports that are pairing with the North. For instance, in the case of Edmonton and Yellowknife. Can Edmonton support Yellowknife? There's an idea that needs to be thought about. Another idea, of course, is the percentage of any airport rent paid. And again, in the case of Edmonton, to use that as an example, they, on the 1st of January, have to come up with $13 million a year. NATA believes possibly a portion of that could be allocated directly to the pairing airport in the case of Yellowknife. We think it's wrong that the North, with a population with an area half the size of Canada almost, and a population of approximately Kingston, Ontario, if you will, should be expected to pay for the infrastructure through landing fees and user fees at places like Yellowknife, where they have 250,000 movements compared to Pearson, which I believe last year was something like 45 million. And finally, we believe that NICAP funding should be expanded, and we call that Northern Capital Assistance Program. And we believe there should be included airports that are not necessarily certified by transport, but they could be simply registered. In other words, they may not meet all of the requirements to meet the regular ACAP funding, but we do believe that should not preclude them for being made system safe and of a standard as required by the rest of Canada. So again, big opportunity here, particularly when one reviews the Office of the Auditor General's report, looking for funding to be implemented and support several large development projects underway right now. We'll talk about that more in a second. So here's a summary of a couple of the research and development opportunities. Number one is the northern use of biofuels, and again, you can look at Garden for projects underway with Porter Airlines, as well as BC-based companies are looking into how we can reduce our dependency on kerosene. Northern aviation training and research, and again, farther below I've got a listing of NSERC and the work that we've done with Seneca College that I was involved with in the development of a simulator training program to have a better direct entry level program for Air Canada Jazz. It's working very well. We need something like that for the North. We need a northern training program for Northerners in the North, and right now we now have a 2-year aviation college program in Whitehorse. But again, for the academics on the call, there's a lot of human resource and human factors study and work like that to be done. As we move forward into number 3 is the human factors research into fatigue. We're now very aware that fatigue is a disabling issue. We've known it, it's nothing new, but the science is far more advanced. We have 24-hour days. Today is a 24-hour day in Yellowknife. And 6 months from now, it'll be 24 hours of darkness for a period of about 25 days. Nobody's really measured the effect on the working people overall, pilots, flight crew particularly. Number 4, alternate power sources in northern climates for transportation. Again, we have to fly in and transport in thousands and thousands of gallons of diesel fuel per year. Is there a better way? Is there alternate power sources that we can use? Again, for the transportation industry, there's about 100 to 120 aircraft, maybe, all up in the north. But for every aircraft, there's probably a dozen support vehicles, ground vehicles. Is there a better way that we can reduce the dependency on any form of carbon fuel with these vehicles? Again, is the question that we're posing ourselves, because it's a huge inventory of fuel that's brought in every year. It's a lot of work. Can we reduce our workload and increase our operational efficiencies? And then finally, again, we're continuing to improve the efficiency of aircraft overall. And along with that, we're seeing, as we use the term, disruptive technology is now coming into the business, UAVs. Can we do a better job of using UAVs in some of the monitoring and inspections that we have to do in the north? We've spoken about airships is another way in which this could supplement some of the lift capabilities that we need. So again, work to be done. Here's a list of the various funding agencies that we've looked at, and again, I wanted to highlight, and I think it's useful, that on August 8th and 9th at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, there's a variety of funders getting together, and that would be a good opportunity for those who would like to see what the funding is taking place. And then finally, the IRAF funding link is there as useful as well. Sorry about that. The big one that's worthwhile speaking about is the new investment bank that the Liberal government has established, and the P3 opportunities and the temptation of privatization. This is a picture of the old terminal at Frobisher Bay for those who have been to Frobisher Bay, the big yellow machine. And on the right is the new terminal at Iqaluit. That's part of approximately a $350 million investment by a consortium based on a French company who is building that terminal. The grand opening is on August 9th. Again, the technology is this building is built to move in accordance with the permafrost, so that we don't have the same impact on it as well. There's an example that the Nunavut government had to do something to get the funding. This is what they've done to get the funding, to secure the funding, and in 30 years the French consortium will give the airport back to them, and then they will operate it for 20 years as a government-owned entity before they have to rebuild it. It's got a 50-year life expectancy. This is a far-reaching idea, as with any big program like this, there's always critics. But I think it's important to realize in the next slide how the world's transportation routes are changing, and why this is important. This is one of the few paved runways in the north. It's an entry airport for Nunavut. It's 8,000 feet long, I believe. But here's a picture of what's happening. You can see on the left, the 1960s, 1990s, we had track lines, some of which went across the Arctic area, but not that much. As you can see in the 2000s, with the long-range aircraft of today that we have, the 787 example, the oversight flights from places like the overflights from Singapore direct to New York, for instance, you can see there's going to be a lot more polar traffic. It's more fuel efficient, but this is already impacting the infrastructure. Recently, Swiss Air, for instance, had a problem in which they had an engine problem, and they had to land in Iqaluit, and they had to do an engine change, and that meant approximately 300 people had to be put up in Iqaluit. That isn't easy to do in a town that we've already spoken about has limited resources. That's only going to increase. It's a good thing to have that business come in. But it's kind of reminiscent, for those who remember online, of the days of the technical overseas stop system that was set up in Gander, and why Gander was formed in the first place. That seems to be now moving towards the north with places like Iqaluit, Yellowknife, and possibly other airplanes like Rankin Inlet, possibly Resolute, may be getting more traffic for all the right reasons. Tourism's increasing. As we know, there's a shift in the climate change. In summary, there's a lot of opportunity in the north. Only 14% of Canadians have been to the north, and that seems to be changing around. And there's a lot of attention being paid right now as we speak on the 150th anniversary of Canada. Thank you very much, and again, there's my coordinates if I can be of any assistance.
Thanks, Glenn. I was off your right elbow there for your entire presentation, hopefully off camera, and appreciate very much the breadth and depth of your experience, as I'm sure everyone in the audience does. We have a few questions here that I'd like to run past you. I guess one of the points that you've made repeatedly from a variety of different angles is the need for money in order to maintain, if not to improve, the infrastructure in the north and to make possible all the things that we want to do up there or need to do. In particular, you mentioned Minister Garneau and his statement acknowledging the importance of increasing investment in the north in order to, as an enabling activity. Minister Garneau, by the way, is also an astronaut. Maybe we can touch on that in a minute, or an ex-astronaut. But you also mentioned the difficulty of getting funding up there, that it can get complicated, and you mentioned public-private partnerships, including offshore partners. Made me think in the road situation of one of the highways in Toronto that's actually owned by a Spanish consortium. So the question here is, does NATA or should we as Canadians have a concern about these offshore partners, and do we have adequate methods in place to control them and to manage their involvement? And in the event that they aren't behaving themselves, do we have any recourse?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. And again, all you have to do is watch the news virtually every day, and people are wondering about the investment banks. It's a imaginative way to raise money. But as I said a couple of weeks ago in an interview with a northern newspaper, the trouble with Canada, we got too much geography and not enough people. That's the problem. And there just isn't enough money to fund all these new projects that are coming up. If you go to the Infrastructure Bank website and to see the projects, the top 100 projects that they're funded, the only one from aviation that's in there is the Iqaluit Airport. That doesn't, and the other 99 are just as important as well. Every bridge in Canada, I think, needs to be replaced. So there's a lot of challenge to get access to the funding.
So, as a follow-on question, people in other countries, clearly, or some few anyway, with the projects that are already in place, have indicated they believe an investment in one of these projects makes sense. Their shareholders approve of this way of trying to get a return on their investment. Well, maybe maybe one of the things that we need to do better is to do a sales job on our own domestic sources of funding and businesses. I mean, there may not be enough money in Canada to do all this stuff, but maybe some additional funds could be found by pitching the ideas more aggressively or successfully. And I wonder if there are ways that you think we could do if that's important, and if so, what can we do better?
Great question. I think one of the greatest success stories in Canada is Provincial Airlines down in Atlantic, Canada. I'm a bit biased because I worked there for a while, but they, of course, set up the offshore. They developed what was known as the ADAM system, which is the Area Data Acquisition Management System, and they have now taken over the 200-mile surveillance. The patrols away from the Canadian military, as well as the patrols for the Department of Fisheries, work that was once traditionally done by Coast Guard and the Canadian military. They've taken that burden away, and they've now exported that technology to 9 different countries. It's a huge success story out of Newfoundland. I was proud to be with it at one time. That's the type of idea that could be translated to the north, where we have but one icebreaker. We have at any given time maybe 2 or 3 aircraft of the Canadian military. At any given time, the Russians have 9 icebreakers in the north now, and they're increasing their presence. So there's an area that I see an easy government-private partnership could take place by the use of already assets in the north to bring them alive in areas that we need to do. It's not just the surveillance, for instance, in this story that we're telling now. It's not just the sovereignty patrols, but it's also the support that's going to be needed for the increased tourism, which is happening. We're going to have, I think it's 3 cruise ships this year are going through. And that's a good news story. You can't say it's not, and we just can't say no when somebody says this is a new idea. We don't do that. We have to accept that this is the north, the new future for the north, that it is going to be more accessible.
Does speaking of surveillance and simply having the ability to gather and process information from that vast area, the use of unmanned systems is increasing in so many different areas, from military to commercial to super commercial, like Amazon delivering your next package to your doorstep with a UAV. The question here, I guess, is within the ranks of NATA, is there any interest to join NATA from the UAV community? It would strike me that they would find your organization very useful in getting the message out and in finding business opportunities.
Very much so. We do have companies with UAVs belonging to NATA now, and certainly the mining industry. Just recently, I watched a UAV that's been set up in Northwest Territories to do grid line layouts with infrared and magnometer on board. It was nickel and iron ore they were looking for. Well, what a great way. I mean, that thing can stay up on grid for 24 hours. It's just amazing, and that's you can't get in the way of that technology. You can't deny it. It's going to happen.
Right. Well, UAVs are one sort of relatively newcomer to the scene, and then you mentioned also ADS-B and the use of satellite technology. Again, the vastness of the area and the inhospitability of it combined to make operations in the north particularly challenging. So if you can be doing that from 250 miles up, doing what you need to do, at least you're not going to be having to deal with terrestrial issues. So communication, GPS activities, meteorology, these are all areas that I guess are very important. Does NATA have any input directly from the Canadian Space Agency, from the space sector at all?
Not yet. You can easily see that's going to be taking place. It was interesting to note that it was just 2 days ago, there was a NASA Gulfstream aircraft in the Iqaluit for some reason. I don't know why, but it was. But NASA's always been interested in the north, as you know.
Especially our north.
Yeah, our north, yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of other questions. Do we have time? Regarding regarding NATA, once again, as executive director, you've got your finger on the pulse, I think, with the membership, both the full members and the associate members, of a lot of the priorities that that the industry has in the north. What would you consider to be, other than funding, are there any other sort of top-level priorities that you think as Canadians we should be aware of?
Well, there's one while you're on the phone, and please spread this word to everybody who's got a nephew or a niece, a daughter or a son. We are going to require, by the year 2025, 6,000 pilots for the Canadian domestic market alone. All right, the worldwide pilot shortage is approximately 200,000 by 25. I know it's hard to believe. So there's a real opportunity for young Canadians to get into the aviation business. The average age now is basically, I don't know, you're looking at it, you know, a good-looking
44,
a good-looking 66, a good-looking 60-year-old. But truly, so huge opportunity is an area we're facing in all levels of humans getting involved in the industry. When you mention ADS-B, I don't know how we're going to get the Canadian fleet all upgraded. Because we need to do 3 aircraft per day till 2020, and we're not doing 3 aircraft a week yet. So again, for graduates coming out of any of the, from UBC to Algonquin College, avionics guys are going to have a real good opportunity in the Canadian aviation industry.
So in addition to a direct support to the infrastructure that supports flying, that is to say runways and terminals and radars and you know, weather forecasting and reporting and so on, there's the whole sort of civilian infrastructure, like you were talking about accommodation challenges and just roadways and getting in and out in ways other than by air. Are there opportunities for private companies to get involved in building hotels and restaurants and stuff like that? Do you know if there's a sustained enough demand that you could actually make money at it?
I gotta give a plug to Air North. First Air Canadian North is that if you go to the north, you get a free, you get a full hot meal included in your trip. And the reason why that was set up, the tradition of that, is quite often people were flying to north or landing in places where you weren't going to get any food. There was no restaurants. So that's the tradition of why the
they didn't just hand out rifles.
Yeah, go get your own food. Now you'll find that just about every northern community, from Inuvik to Arctic Bay, has bed and breakfasts. There's been a lot of good work set up to get micro businesses on the go with the local community. Are there tourism opportunities like we see in other parts of the world? Absolutely. That's got nowhere else to go but grow.
How are we doing for time?
We're good.
Yeah. So from the standpoint of pilot development, it makes me think about standard operating procedures and the kind of training that pilots need to have. For operations in the north, of course, as a participant in Aero last month, you had a chance to hear John Maris's talk about icing and how his research in his PhD that was laid out in his PhD dissertation challenged some of the training and procedures that pilots are taught these days, and it was his finding that maybe the responses to a warning in the cockpit might not be the best necessarily. So this gets to the idea about what special kinds of training procedures need to be involved with flying in the north. You mentioned also fatigue as a particular issue, and the conversation you had earlier this week about fatigue with the government, and that somehow more information needs to be imparted to those guys so that policies can be perhaps a little bit more insightful about operations in the north. Do you want to talk about that a little more?
Yeah. Next week at our board meeting is is June 29th next week in Vancouver, and we're bringing in Professor Amy Kim, and she works at the University of Southern Alberta, and she's going to start a study for us to look at the correlation between the lack of infrastructure with operational efficiencies and how that is causing a problem with flight and duty time. In other words, we're launching to go to an airport that doesn't have adequate resources, and because of we didn't get the weather and the weather's gone bad, or bad weather made the runway unsafe to land on, or whatever reason, we can't go there now. All right? We could have got there if we'd had this infrastructure. We can't go there. So now we have to go somewhere else. Well, that has problems too. We've had situations where we've had to go to a third airport. In the aviation business, you always have a plan B, they say. In the north, you have a plan B and a plan C because things can change. So there's a study that we're going to be announcing next week, and we're going to be working with the territorial governments. And this is going to help us isolate and identify which airports are causing the most problems right now that need infrastructure funding. Because that's the big question now is, okay, we know every airport's suffering. Which one goes first? Which one will we put the money into first? And again, everybody will give you, of 117 airports, there'll be 117 people with a different opinion, depending on which one's their home base. So there's this is the type of stuff that we're trying to work with the government. And again, we've also formed a fatigue system safety group in which we're going to do a better job of working with the pilot community. And one of the problems we have is pilots don't talk up and just get the job done, and that's what they do, and they don't talk as well about the stuff that affects them. So there's a challenge, and again, this is where we're now having to work closer with the medical community.
Mm-hmm. Is there a push to upgrade or to improve the services available at airports so that larger airplanes can land? We think about the bush plane and ski-equipped smaller aircraft. That's all very well, but you've talked about how a B-737 is going to have deflection plates on it to keep the undercarriage from getting smashed up when it's landing and stuff like that. How much of a push is coming from the operators to upgrade, and is that going to be of any use in terms of identifying where funding can come from?
It is, because the push is on, because the 737-200 did have deflectors. I won't go into the various systems. They had a skid, sled, if you will, on the front nose wheel, so that when it threw up gravel, it would throw the gravel to the side and miss the aircraft. The new 737s, 500, 600, and 700s, which are now flying in the north, the engines are a lot lower. You cannot make them able to resist gravel in the way the earlier airplanes did. We just can't. They're much more, if I want to say delicate, I guess that's the right word. They're just not as robust to land on those surfaces. So we are now already infrastructure restricted. The two aircraft that we want to use and we can't use to go into certain airports.
So as an operator of an airline, that would significantly constrain the degree to which I can upgrade my fleet with newer models, I suppose.
Well, it does, and of course, remember in the north, it's special that we do things that the south don't do. You have a lot of passengers every day flying. We carry on. Every airplane in the north is always split into a combi, and we can make that airplane because every community needs stuff. Not every community has people going out every day. There might be one or two, and that makes the loads very thin. But every time we go into a community, we can bulk out or weight out with the stuff we have to take into the communities. And that now brings up another social economic study that I would love to have in is the amount of stuff that we take into communities is mind-boggling to me. And again, Maybe this is an area that, again, researchers on the phone maybe want to be interested to look at. Again, why do we have to take bottled water into the north? Can we not bottle water in the north? Is that not an opportunity? Again, that's just a small example of, because we know the impact of plastic on the environment.
One of the other points you made, or a passing reference you made, was to the annual general meeting of CARIC that's taking place in Vancouver in August. I plan to be there. I guess probably you're hoping to, or you will be. This could be a good opportunity, and anybody on the phone who is aware of what this consortium is all about. Generally, it wants to bring together academia and industry to develop projects to the point of their being commercializable. And this seems to me to be an area where CARIC could really very much get involved, and hopefully some of the folks on the phone will either tune into CARIC and get a little bit more informed about it, or even attend the meeting and have a coffee with you and me while they're out there.
That'd be a good idea. There's several of our members are going to that for that specific reason. I mean, that's why they've got this conference.
Right.
I find those agencies are very receptive. They want to help.
Yeah. Well, CASI just signed an MOU with CARIC, and we will actually be publishing their project reports for them as a way of getting the word out a little more broadly, giving them a publication arm. So I guess are we getting pretty close to the end of our time frame here? Five more minutes. This is one of the things that I think we ought to do for you, Glenn, and as a way of at least acknowledging the time and effort you spent on this presentation, is to give you an opportunity to talk about a little bit specifically about NATA, what the members enjoy as in the way of benefits from the association, and maybe give them an idea of why they would want to join if they're not members yet.
Very straightforward. NATA was formed just over 40 years ago, and it's different in that it wasn't set up as an initial operators trade association in the typical sense. It was set up to work with the territorial governments in the development of the North, particularly in the development of the oil and gas resources. That's in our mandate. That's what we were set up to do. We set ourselves up as an offspring from the Air Transport Association of Canada. We still maintain excellent relationships with ATAC. It was a very amicable split. We recognize ATAC as a national association. We are a regional association. We just represent a whole bunch of regions. One of the neatest things about membership, and this doesn't dissuade from any other organization, we all have characters. We got more. We got Buffalo Joe. We've got Joe Sparling of Air North. We're doing neat things up there, and I'm proud. I'm just so proud. I serve at the pleasure of the board. It's a pleasure to serve. But again, the type of thing that we have as a success story is Air North. All right, the proper name for it is Air North, the Yukon's airline. And again, innovative ideas, what they did to raise up, when you talk raise capital, I think every Yukoner, I don't know, what is there, about 40,000 all up, owns a share, $1,000 share in Air North. That's the model that was set up for the NFL, and the only team in the NFL left was the Green Bay Packers. All right, you and me and the barber bought a share way back when, and it's worth a lot more money now. But that's why Green Bay Packers is such a great team and such local community support, and hence the success of Air North. You feel proud that you're an owner of it. That type of new way of thinking is really taking hold. The way we're hiring people in the North is changing. The airlines, to hang on to people, are actually giving employees shares in the company, kind of like the WestJet example, if you will, but on a much smaller scale, because of the movement, shall we say, of people away. The biggest challenge at all, in my mind, though, is how can we engage the Aboriginal community better. Most of the airlines in Canada, by the way, are Aboriginally owned, but there isn't the same number of Aboriginal workers as there should be. We need to do a better job up there. Did you know by the year 2025, 1 in 4 Canadians below the age of 25 is going to be Aboriginal? It's a huge workforce that we need to tap into. So again, to me, that's one of the challenges that I think we can do better at. When I say do better at, we're doing a good job. but we can do a good job better. Air Inuit, for instance, has a program, I believe it's called the Sparrow Program. They now have 13 Inuit people are now captains as in the Air Inuit fleet. They have one of the highest percentiles of female flight crew in the fleet. Moving south a little bit, by the way, one of the highest percentiles in the world is Porter Airlines. Has 25% of their flight crew are females, which is terrific. The average in the world is about 6-7%. So that's a huge workforce that we can do a better job with. Again, in the north, it's just making people aware that there's other alternatives to having a job. The traditional is great, but there could be new stuff. And I got to give a shout out, if I can, and thank you for giving me the opportunity, for the Arctic Air Tour that's taking place right today in Cambridge Bay, over top of Cambridge Bay for the first time in a long time. There's an air show taking place by civilian aircraft. They're making 150 stops. Cambridge Bayers are 49th. What a great opportunity to get Northerners looking up and seeing that there's a big world out there.
That sounds like a very a very appropriate point at which to wrap this up. Certainly that's true, and the extent to which any local population can get involved in solving its own problems is a benefit to everyone. Let's hope that the way the local population evolves its solutions continues to be congruent with what the federal government wants to do. You've mentioned some points of divergence when it comes to opinions about the best way forward. It's going to be important for our federal government to continue to work closely with the indigenous populations to really understand why it is that they suggest the solutions they do, and to help them to get things done the way their own populations feel like would be the best way to go. And I guess that also would encourage some academic institutions to locate their training and even not just the training, but also the curriculum delivery, the course delivery facilities in the north.
That's right.
So that folks don't have to come south, which can kind of wrench your family around a bit, and it's expensive and so on.
That's right.
I guess that's a wrap. Glenn, thank you so much for coming. It's been a real pleasure to have a chance to get personally to get back in touch with you through our activities this year, and hopefully NATA and CASI can develop closer rapport and more useful forms of collaboration through the two of us continuing to stay in touch. And until then, safe travels, and thank you everyone in the audience. Thank Glenn on behalf of all of you for sharing his time with us today.
Thank you.
Can you talk about our next webinar?
Oh, and our next webinar, yes. The date of which I cannot announce. The topic is a point of mystery for some of us, including myself, but we're working on it. The big question we have about our next webinar is what would be the best time to suit all of you out there. We want to make sure that as audience participants, our programming is as accessible to you as we can make it. We're getting into the 2 months of high summer, so we're discussing when would be the best time for our next webinar presentation. I can tell you though that it will have a space theme, and we'll be telling you more about that in the weeks to come as we refine these the terms of reference. So thank you once again. Thank you, Glenn. Thank all of you for participating, and thank Danielle very much for being our producer.
I just want to mention to ask people to please answer the post-webinar survey, please.
Yeah, if you didn't catch that from Danielle, we'll be sending out a survey to you very shortly. We appreciate your input, your impressions about the webinar, specifically and more generally. How can we make sure that you're getting the most out of the time you spend with us? So thanks again, and until next time, see you. So do I do this now?